This is a 2017 Range Rover. It's a little bit different from all the other 2017 Range Rovers. That's because this one is a limousine. And while you may think a regular Range Rover is luxurious, this one takes it up a notch. Today, I'm going to show you what I mean. I've borrowed this Range Rover from iLUSSO, which is an exotic car dealership here in Orange County in Southern California that has an amazing inventory of exotic cars, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, pretty much anything that you can think of. They asked me if I wanted to choose something from their inventory to review, so I started looking around and I saw this. This is a 2017 Range Rover with a supercharged V6, a black exterior, and a nice leather interior. One thing I like about this is that it's a pretty subtle limo conversion. They didn't go for some wild look-at-me color or some huge chrome rims. Instead, it's just a regular Range Rover, except you look at it and you think, wow, that person is rich. Just how rich? Well, let's just say this isn't the type of car you'd want to drive. Instead, it's the kind of car you'd want to be driven around in. So you figure you're paying some guy just to sit up front and drive you around. Then it's not that cheap to make a limo out of a Range Rover. You start with a Range Rover, that's like $100 grand, and then to convert it to a limo, it's another $120,000, just so you can be driven around in luxury. And today, I'm going to show you just how luxurious it is. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of this Range Rover, and I'm going to show you all of the interesting quirks and features of a very luxury SUV. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Range Rover Limo in the most important place to start, and that would be the back. Now, the moment you step inside this thing, you realize this is not some massive stretch limo designed to hold 20 people that you can rent for your bachelorette party. Instead, it's just stretched enough to provide additional space and luxury for the wealthy executive who could buy your family. And so with that in mind, I'm going to start with some of the exclusive luxuries back here, and that means starting with this screen. This screen is mounted on the ceiling in the center, and it's sort of the nerve center for all the cool stuff back here. I'm going to start with the TV. If you go to entertainment in this screen, you can turn on the TV because of course there is a TV. It includes Apple TV. We don't have an internet connection right now, but if we did, we could be watching my YouTube videos while we're being chauffeured around in the luxury Range Rover. Of course, this TV also has an HDMI input, meaning that you could plug in a video game console in case you wanted to play video games while you're being chauffeured around in your luxury Range Rover. So that is a very exciting entertainment opportunity to occupy you in the back seat. But the TV is not just a TV. It's also a partition. Go back to this center screen, press partition along the bottom, and you can see there are several options. If you go over to divider and press down, you will see that the TV automatically retreats down into the car, and suddenly there is an opening between the front compartment and the luxury passenger compartment. You would drop the TV if, for example, you wanted to say something to the driver or be in communication with the driver. Now, when you want the driver gone and out of sight, you just press divider up, and then the TV pops right back up, the divider is in place, and you no longer have to put up with the driver. Now, next up, also included in the partition tab in this center screen, you have the control for the sunroof. And the sunroof in this Range Rover is really, really cool. I say that because it's a panoramic sunroof that actually opens up. If you open the sunroof, you can see that it doesn't just open the sunshade like it does in the back seat of most luxury cars, but it actually opens the glass sunroof so you can have airflow in through the roof and you can see out into the world. So this actually opens the sunroof. Unfortunately, only the front glass panel can open. The rear glass panel is fixed in place, but that's better than what you get in most luxury vehicles. And the final option under partition in this screen is the curtain, and that would be the curtain for the sunroof. If you want to open the curtain, you can. It will open it all the way back if that's what you want, and then you have sun coming in. Or, of course, you can also close the curtain. You can close it completely, and then it's darker back here, so you can be in your luxury cocoon. Of course, you can also choose to stop the curtain anywhere in between in case you want some sun and some darkness. And next up in that center ceiling screen, you have a tab called Climate. If you press Climate, you can see it brings up a lot of different climate functions and displays, including a display that shows the current temperature inside the vehicle. Now, you can change that temperature very quickly by using all of the other stuff in this climate screen. You can increase the fan speed, you can drop the air temperature, you can turn on air conditioning and heat, basically all your climate controls. And when you're doing this, it's only affecting the rear compartment. So the front person can have their own climate settings, and then you can have something completely different going on back here. And I will say, when you have the climate controls all the way up, you feel a lot of heat or air conditioning, whichever you selected. Now, our next interesting item in this center screen is the intercom. That's right, there's an intercom. In case you are watching something important on the TV and you don't want to drop it down in order to speak to the driver, you can turn on the intercom to speak to the driver. You can see there's an on or off. You press it, and then you're in communication. And you can turn up the volume in case you can't quite hear what the driver is saying. Just adjust it on your screen. You don't even have to speak any louder. But my very favorite thing about the intercom control back here is the fact that you can lock it. So let's pretend the driver is trying to talk to you, but you don't want to be bothered. Press this little lock button, and then the driver can no longer communicate with you with the intercom. You've locked him out, and now you're in your cocoon, and you cannot be bothered. Now, our next interesting item in this center ceiling screen is the lighting tab. The most interesting thing about the lighting tab is the fact that you can use that tab to control the seats. And I'm specifically talking about these jump seats that face backwards. If you press, for instance, left seat down, you can see that the left seat automatically moves down, and that way there is an additional seat back here for people to sit. Of course, you can do the same thing over on the other side with the right seat. Now, like I mentioned before, this vehicle was not built to carry a lot of people. And as you can see, these seats do not look particularly comfortable. They're basically straight up in back, and most of the time they're intended to be folded away. But they're there in a pinch in case you want to carry a few more people in the back of your Range Rover. Mostly this back compartment is just for kind of laying down, stretching out, and enjoying your luxuries, but those seats are there and they're automatic. And of course, when you're done using them, just go back into your lighting tab and you can press the button to automatically put the seats back up, and they will whir back into place, therefore giving you additional legroom back here without these seats bothering you unless you need them. Now, speaking of seats, I want to mention real quick something rather interesting with the luxury seats back here, the ones you're supposed to be sitting on. On the right side, you have a regular Range Rover seat. No surprise there. But the back seat of a Range Rover has a 60-40 split. So you're wondering, how did they get this to work considering it's no longer 60-40 and you have this big center console, which I'll cover in a second? Well, the answer is that they cut the seat that's on the 60 side of the 60-40 split, and then they just reupholstered the entire thing. Now, I would never have noticed this, but it was pointed out to me by the person who actually owns the company who did the conversion. And if you look, you can see the seatbelt is a little different on one side compared to the other, and so is the bolster. It's just a little bit wider on one side compared to the other in order to account for this 60-40 split. So these two seats are not actually symmetrical back here, even though that is something you would never notice if you spent any time in this vehicle. It's a pretty nifty trick for getting two seats in a giant center console. But anyway, back to that center ceiling screen. I want to go back to the lighting tab and talk about the actual lighting. The first lighting item you can turn on is the interior lights. And if you turn that on, you can see these two LED lights sort of in the center of this rear compartment turn on. And then you can use the lighting tab to dim them if you want, or to make them brighter, whatever you want to do. And you can also use the lighting tab in the screen to turn them off. But this isn't your only lighting opportunity back here. You also have the divider lights. Turn on the divider light and you can see it lights up this area around the TV, and it really is a nice look, a good mood light. Again, that's something you can control. You can turn it on and off and on and off to your heart's content. Your final lighting option back here is your bar light. You can turn on the bar light, and then that actually illuminates the bar, which is sort of in the middle, in the front part, right under the TV. Again, you can turn that on or off, and the bar light will turn on. You can also dim it if you want. One really cool thing about the bar lights, by the way, if you turn on the bar lights, there's actually lights illuminating the bottom of these drink glasses. So if you have a drink in here, it will illuminate whatever liquid you happen to be drinking. That is a pretty cool effect back here. And next up, let's talk about the bar, since that's a feature you don't get in your typical Range Rover. It's between the two jump seats in the front of this rear compartment. Looks good, fairly luxurious bar, and has a couple of interesting quirks. Starting on the bottom, if you pull off this black cover, you can see there's an ice tray down here. You can fill this with ice to keep bottles chilled, if that's what you want to do while you're being chauffeured around. Of course, you also have a set of drinking glasses back here, 4 specifically, one for each rear seat, and you can pick them up and look at them, and they look very nice and luxurious. And at the very top of this bar, you can pull off another cover, and you have a little pad here. Maybe this is for an ashtray or some other storage, but that's your basic bar in the back of your stretched Range Rover. And next up, we move on to the other interesting center item in here, and that would be the partition between the more luxurious rear seats. A couple of interesting items in here, one of which is the radio. Now, to turn on the radio, you go back into the center ceiling screen, go over to entertainment, press radio power, and that turns on the radio. And once you have the radio on, you can see this is a fairly standard aftermarket Alpine head unit. It connects with Bluetooth, or it has Sirius XM, or the regular radio, or various other different inputs. Fairly standard, but important to mention that you do have a radio back here and full controls at your disposal. Now, other items in this center partition, one, you can see you have cup holders back here, one for each seat, not particularly exciting or interesting. If you open up this center compartment, you can see you have a nice little storage area back here, pretty deep, where you can stick stuff, and you have 3 separate USB ports for charging, which would be really nice if you're being chauffeured around, you want to charge your devices. You can do it here with your custom center partition. The one thing you don't have is a refrigerator. Sorry, people, you won't be able to refrigerate your things in the back of your stretched Range Rover. Truthfully though, the best thing about being here is none of these luxury features. Instead, it's how much room you have in the back to just stretch out. If you're someone who's actually getting chauffeured on a long drive by a chauffeur, I can think of few other things as nice as just sitting back and relaxing. Far, far more space, more comfortable than what you get in basically the back of any standard vehicle. And next up, we move on to the front of the long Range Rover, which is interesting because when you do all that to the back of a Range Rover, some interesting things happen up here. And I want to start with the fact that you have a similar screen in the center of the front ceiling as you did in the center of the rear ceiling. And you have similar controls, but there are some important differences, starting with that intercom. Now, I locked the intercom in back, and as you can see, I cannot turn it on as the front seat driver or passenger in this vehicle. The rear seat passenger has locked me out, and I can no longer communicate with them. They are simply in their rear seat cocoon. The other really interesting difference you have in the front screen compared to the rear screen is chauffeur options. You can press this and mostly it just brings up some settings, but you can also write messages using your chauffeur options screen. So for example, you can write a message, "Hello, my name is Doug. welcome to the Range Rover Limo. How are you doing today? All sorts of things. That way, if you're a chauffeur and you're picking someone up, you don't know them, you're not their personal driver, you don't have to lower the partition or use the intercom and potentially disrupt them or bother them. You can just use the messaging system to introduce yourself. That is a rather interesting idea. Now, the other interesting thing that happens up here is you have a TV behind you and all that other luxury stuff, so there's no real rear window. You could put the TV down and look out, but I suppose that's up to the rear passenger. So as a result, visibility behind you, not all that great. Now, you do still have a rear view mirror, but it's effectively useless as long as the TV partition is in place. It's basically just a mirror that looks at the back of the TV. But the good news is that in this particular long Range Rover, the factory backup camera still works. You shift into reverse and it still shows what's behind you. And the factory parking sensors still work too. You can see it's lighting up as I'm getting closer to this object. It's also beeping. That's a pretty big deal. A lot of limo companies don't bother hooking that stuff all the way back up because they have to run wires even further. It's not worth it. But in this thing, it's like you're driving a factory Range Rover, and it helps dramatically with visibility since the mirror and the rear window are not really in play. Now, in terms of other interesting front seat items in this vehicle, this is pretty much a factory stock Range Rover aside from the stuff I've just mentioned. I have reviewed a normal size 2018 Range Rover. I will link that in the description below in case you want to get into all the other tech and details and quirks and features of a regular Range Rover. And speaking of factory things I like about this Range Rover, I just love the factory look. It doesn't really look like it was modified by a limo company. It looks like the kind of thing that you would commission Land Rover to build for you because you are the prince of some very wealthy nation. It just looks very luxurious, very subtle, and yet at the same time, very not so subtle. Even the factory air suspension still works. You press this button in the center console and the car will lower, or you press it the other direction a few times and it will raise. That's how it works from the factory, and it still works like that even though this one has been cut up and elongated. The only ways that you can tell this isn't a factory Range Rover are, of course, the stretch in the middle, but this has been very well executed and you can't see any paint blends or otherwise ugly scars from when it was pulled apart and elongated. The other way you can tell is the roof. The roof has been increased in height, both to accommodate that large panoramic sunroof I showed you before and for additional headroom in the back. And so the result of that is that it looks a little taller than a regular Range Rover. But otherwise, it just looks like a standard Range Rover, except longer. Until you climb inside, of course. And so those are the quirks and features of the Range Rover Limo. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the stretched Range Rover. And I start while I'm backing up to kind of illustrate that it's actually not all that difficult to maneuver this thing around, despite the fact that it's like 2 feet longer than a regular Range Rover, just because of this backup camera and parking sensor situation. You do that, you get your mirrors, and you're good to go. Also surprising, out on the street, this supercharged V6 feels like it does reasonably well keeping this thing going, which is a bit of a surprise because, you're adding a ton of luxury and features. There's a TV back there, you're adding several feet, a lot more leather. You'd think it would start to feel slow, and it doesn't feel fast. Now, one thing about driving this around, you don't really want to be driving this around. You want to be sitting in the back. But driving it, it doesn't really feel all that different. You'd expect, given that I just went through this long list of crazy upgrades and changes and it looks noticeably different, you'd expect there would be some substantial differences. But the truth is, it just kind of feels like a Range Rover. I could easily see just kind of driving this thing around. It does feel a little heavier. Not when you're accelerating, but kind of when you're slowing down, when you're just carrying momentum and you're not on either pedal, it feels like you're carrying more weight. I feel like I'm driving a Range Rover that's wearing a backpack. Truthfully, I find this thing to be pretty enjoyable to drive along. It's disconcerting every time you look in the rearview mirror and there's no window back there, but maybe I can change that. Aha! There we go. Now I can see behind me. Yeah, mostly this just feels like a Range Rover. Surprisingly so. it's quite a bit more expensive than a Range Rover. Figure like $220,000, $230,000 is what I was told. Steering is where you really do start to feel the additional weight and bulk of this vehicle. When you start to go around a corner, the Range Rover's air suspension is already probably too forgiving and more body roll, more comfort than you'd really need if you wanted to kind of hustle around a corner. This vehicle, because of its extra size, feels even more kind of laborious and slow around corners. Not that that's really a problem. Anybody who buys this thing and complains about the cornering and the handling is an idiot. But it is worth noting that it doesn't feel like, you can't just buy this and be like, oh, you know, I could have had a Range Rover, but I got this instead. Well, it's the same thing. It's not really. There are some driving differences. I think the real benefit, though, is if you just want to sit and be chauffeur driven, this is like the car. You have a big rear compartment, tall, so you can sit up. You don't have to ever worry about anything. It's so luxurious back there. You can, you know, sync your laptop to your TV. The person who built the limo told me that they send a lot of them to China, where chauffeur-driven cars are more common. And of course, cars like this are a little bit more common in major European cities. London, there's a lot of chauffeur-driven cars, but it's kind of a novelty here more than anything. And in the States, limos, chauffeur vehicles, are more something you rent for a wedding, for prom, for a bachelor party, and not something that most people live with day to day. But if you are one of the lucky few who can afford a chauffeur driver, here's your chance. And so that's the Range Rover Limo. I like this because I view it as the ultimate in rich people transportation. Oh, you have a Range Rover? Well, mine is longer than yours. And I have a TV in the back and drink glasses. And I pay someone to take me places. Yes, it's unrealistic for virtually everyone, but you gotta admit, if you had the money, it'd be a pretty nice life. And now it's time to give the Range Rover Limo a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Range Rover Limo looks good, though adding a stretch always compromises aesthetics a bit, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration, I'm not sure what the 0 to 60 time is, but the regular Range Rover with this engine does it in 6.9 seconds. This must be slower, so it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling isn't great. It's not horrible, but it's floaty and it feels big, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is decent, not for the driver, but just because the rear passenger can have so much fun riding in this, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and this is pretty cool. It's no Lamborghini, but you'd still give this a second glance, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 20 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It doesn't have the best tech, but it also has crazy equipment in the back that no normal car has, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Comfort is excellent in back, normal in front, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Quality seems to be good, but we are still dealing with a Range Rover here, now with more electronics added, so long-term reliability may be questionable, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is good. It has a lot of seats and a good cargo area, but parking may be a challenge with the stretch, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are tremendously expensive. Normal people would consider them ridiculous money, and they only work for the truly wealthy. It gets a 5 out of 10 for a total daily score of 36 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 56 out of 100, which places it here against other ultra-luxury SUVs and limos I've reviewed. This doesn't really have a close competitor I've examined, except maybe the modified Sprinter I reviewed a few months ago, and I prefer the Range Rover. Not that any of us will ever have the chance to ride around in back.